к этому стиху перейдем и будем его, как обычно, читать, комментировать. Joel, am I right that you wanted to start our meeting of today with a short mini lecture?
Yes, go right ahead. Oh, that's a joke, yeah. Yes, I have a presentation.
Okay.
Can I share my screen?
Wait a second. Okay. Now I can give you the rights. Yes. Now you can show your screen.
Okay. Can you see this?
Now we see you.
Okay, good. All right. So my assignment.
Joel, sorry. Can you check whether you really can share your screen with us?
Okay, yeah, I probably have to hold on.
Because I have given you the rights to share the screen.
Yeah.
The screen, but we still do not see your screen. We see you, which is fine.
That's good. Yeah. Let's see.
No, that's okay.
That's good. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Now we see some early art.
Yes. Okay. Do you see my title now?
Yes, and we also see girls and boys who are evidently sharing the Messianic secret.
Well, they're sharing a secret.
A secret.
I'm not
Okay.
sure if it's messianic, but okay. Well, I thought I would start with just a survey of the forms of secrecy that there are in Mark. First of all, Jesus several times tells demons not to proclaim his identity. I think this happens 2 times. The first time in chapter 1, in this first exorcism in Capernaum, the demon shouts out, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus says, "Be quiet," or it's really very rude, "Shut up," we would say in colloquial English. So he silences the demon. And that also happens in chapter 3 in one of Mark's summary statements of what typically happened, that the demons would cry out, "You are the Son of God," and he would tell them not to make him known. So that's one form. He silences the demons. Secondly, sometimes he heals people and he warns them not to tell anybody about the healing. For example, at the end of chapter 1, he heals this person with a skin disease, and he says, don't tell anybody about it, but go show yourself to the priest. So that's a second form. He heals people, but he tells them not to make that public. Thirdly, sometimes he instructs the disciples. He gives them secret knowledge, and then he tells them, don't tell anybody about this. And maybe the 2 most important are in chapter 8, this first discussion with the disciples. Who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. And he sternly warns them not to tell anyone about him. So they've had this discussion. Something has been revealed to them, but it's to be kept secret. And that also happens in the important passage in chapter 9, where they're coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and he tells them not to tell what they have seen until the Son of Man rises from the dead. Fourthly, there are cases where he doesn't want people to know he's around. Like in this passage in chapter 7, he goes into a house when he's in the area of Tyre, and it's Mark tells you explicitly that he didn't want anyone to know that he was there. And fifthly, there are cases, and a lot of these overlap. You could say that this fifth one and the third one are related to each other, but there's some very important passages in which he seems to deliberately hide the truth from outsiders. And especially this has to do with the parable theory, where the disciples ask him to explain the parables, and he says, to you, the mystery of the kingdom of God has been given, but not to those outside, so that they may look and not see, hear and not understand. So he's revealing it to them, but hiding it from the outsiders.
Joel,
Yes.
may I ask
No,
questions?
yeah, please. Yes, please do. Yeah.
Yes, of course, it's clear that quite often different items from your list can overlap.
Yes.
But can we say that item number 4 is completely number 5 hides truth from outsiders is completely included in item 3 cautions to disciples? Do they overlap, or do they coincide or include one another?
Yeah, no, I'd say number 5 is a subset of number 3.
Okay.
Yeah. Use mathematical terminology. And this also may be a subset of number 3. Sometimes he goes, secretly instructs the disciples. So in this one, it says that he didn't want anyone to know where he was, because he was instructing the disciples. So it's really linking his seclusion of himself with the disciples with him wanting to instruct them secretly. I should have figured out some way that I didn't have to go through the outline every time to get to where I want to go, but I need some instruction in PowerPoint technique. But anyway, let's see. That's and I think maybe finally, sometimes he performs healings deliberately in secret, like in this passage, where he's healing this person who has speech and hearing difficulties. He takes him and he secludes himself with the person he wants to heal. So so are these all part of the same gestalt? This is the motif that people have named, and maybe this is from William Vredo on, but I think maybe it preceded him, calling this the messianic secret. Well, that's not totally right, because only some of the passages, and as a matter of fact, maybe you could just say one, is really about the fact that he is the Messiah. And that's this first passage where Peter says, you are the Christ, and Jesus says, don't tell anybody about me. That's the only one in which, what he's trying to hide is explicitly the fact that he's the Messiah. But people characteristically lump many of these things together, and they call them all part of the Messianic secret, though there's a big debate, and you can read whole books about, whether or not these are all actually part of the same gestalt. And do they all have the same explanation? And I think those are good questions. But let me now talk a little bit about how people have dealt with these passages in which Jesus tries to keep something secret about himself. So going back to the 19th century, maybe even back to the end of the 18th century, people looking at this often tried to explain these instances from the point of view of history. That is, on the assumption that the Gospels were totally historical, and so what they narrated about Jesus must have been what happened, and then you have to explain why it happened. And so one possible explanation for some of these passages is that Jesus wanted to protect himself and his disciples. For example, this passage at the end of chapter 1, where he tells the guy with the skin disease, don't tell anyone, but the guy goes out and he tells everyone. And Jesus and his disciples are mobbed. Many people come to them, and he can't go into cities anymore because he's become so popular that if he goes into a city, he'll be mobbed. And so he's out in the desert places, but still people come to him.
Sure.
Yeah.
Once again, I would like to ask you for a comment on this passage. What was the fact that Jesus feared of and wanted this not to happen? And in order this not to happen, he was not entering big cities. Was he, according to the narrative that we have before us, afraid of being arrested or mistreated, or on the contrary, he was afraid of his name becoming too popular, and because he was afraid of glory among the human beings, which can cause damage to his unity with God? Or
I think you could explain this in all of those ways. I guess in this particular case, it seems to be, you do have the passage later on in which Jesus and his disciples, they don't even have time to eat, right? Because he's become so popular. So I guess I was looking at this one as maybe analogous to that, that it's just easier to get around if, you're not so famous. It's like a Hollywood star, can't walk down the street in New York City without all sorts of people recognizing him. And then you have a crowd. So I think that's maybe a possible reason for this one, but I think you're anticipating the next point. Another possibility is he doesn't want some of these secrets to get out because he doesn't want people to get a misconception about him. For example, it has often been argued that he didn't want people to think that he was the wrong sort of the Messiah. He wasn't just a Messiah who was performing all these works of power, but at least, in the overall arc of the story, he is the sort of Messiah who suffers and dies. So it's possible, and people have often argued this, that he was opposing himself a theology of glory. He didn't want to be that sort of glorious Messiah, or he didn't want to be the sort of Messiah that was expected. that is often a military figure with political ramifications. And so that was actually a very popular theory in the 19th century. So I think you can explain this desire to keep himself incognito in many different ways. And I'll come at the end to, maybe some of what I think, though I have to say every time I look at this, I become more confused because the picture is confusing. I don't think it's totally consistent. Um, and um, and one of the problems is that some of these passages don't even seem to make sense on the level of narrative. For example, this passage, which is just the end of a long couple of miracles in which Jesus was approached at the beginning of chapter 1 or earlier in the chapter by the president of the synagogue, who has said that his daughter is on the point of death. So there's this big crowd there. Jesus goes with the leader of the synagogue and his disciples towards the leader's house. And then on the way, a woman steals a healing from him. And he has a conversation with her. And she is healed when she touches him. And he says, "Your faith has saved you." And then he goes on to the synagogue ruler's house. He takes only his 3 disciples. He goes into the inner chamber. There's these women lamenting there. He throws them out. He says first, the child is not dead, but sleeping. He throws these mourners out. And then he raises this girl from the dead. And so my question is, how does this make sense? He raises the girl from the dead, and then he tells the people who are there, which is only his disciples and the parents of the girl, don't let anybody know what's happening. Now, don't let anybody know what has happened. Now, how can that be a secret? Because there's this big crowd there. Everybody has seen him go into the synagogue ruler's house. They are going to see the girl who they have heard was dead. They are going to see her alive and walking around. How can it be a secret? So this, I think, Vreda already talks about this as a passage which narratively does not make sense. And that is what led Vreda to say that the messianic secret idea is not primarily a historical reminiscence, but it rather, in Mark's gospel, reflects a dogmatic conception. That is, that it's not, we shouldn't try to interpret it by coming up with plausible historical reasons why Jesus hid himself in these ways, because that's not where this primarily comes from. He thinks that it comes from the theology of the church, and for him, the key to the whole secret is this passage, 9:9. Don't tell anybody what you have seen until the Son of Man rises from the dead. So for Vreda, at least a big part of what the secret is about is the difference between the time of Jesus' lifetime and the post-Easter period. That is, that the secret motif says that who Jesus was a secret, more or less, during his lifetime, and that's the way it had to be, because it was only his resurrection that revealed who he was. So that, again, this 9:9 is the key passage for Vrede. And the secret is about the difference between the time of Jesus and the time of the church. Now, there are various, do you want to say anything about that?
I have a lot of, I always had a lot of questions that I would like to ask Frede, and I would like, and because Frede is not with us anymore,
I'm channeling Vrede, yeah.
yes, I would like to ask you about this, but maybe closer to the end of your
right.
lecture.
Okay, well, I wanted to point out there are some difficulties with Freda's theory. For example, how about if it's all about the difference between Jesus' lifetime and the time of the church when the secrets are revealed, how about the passages in Jesus' lifetime in the gospel in which there is a revelation? You know, for example, in this passage which we already looked at, you know, he tells this man with the skin disease whom he has healed, don't say anything to anybody, but he goes out and he reveals it to everybody. So the secret does come out, and is that necessarily a bad thing? It doesn't seem like a bad thing. You know, because of this publicity about Jesus, all sorts of people are flocking to him. I think what Vrede does acknowledge passages like this, and what he says is that Mark is trying to hold two contradictory ideas in his mind. One is the difference between the time of Jesus and the time of the church, but the other is that Jesus was just so powerful a character that who he was couldn't help slipping out, even during his lifetime. And it also has to do with the nature of Mark's narrative. It is, on the one hand, a story about what happened to Jesus during his own lifetime. But on the other hand, and this is like my formulation, on the other hand, it is also a story about what's happening now. It's also a story that's transparent to our own situation. So, like when you read a story, when Mark's readers read a story, say about Jesus, you know, coming to the disciples, and they're in a boat and they're trying to get across the sea, and there's this storm rising, and then all of a sudden they see Jesus coming to them. They're going to say, that is what is happening to us too. Jesus comes and saves us just when things look worse. So Vrede would say that, you know, some of these inconsistencies have to do with various narrative aims that Mark has. On the one hand, to establish the difference between Jesus' lifetime and the time of the church. On the other hand, to show how Jesus relates to the church now. I'm coming, but I think even Vrede actually recognizes that, and he is often misinterpreted by people who don't realize that there is this nuance. Vrede also says that Mark did not make up the messianic secret. He said that it at least goes back, you know, to those who were handing on stories to Mark. I think he doesn't want to push it all the way back to the historical Jesus, but he at least says that Mark isn't the one who invented the whole thing. And I think he points to, or I would point to, the fact that a passage like this one, in which Jesus takes this man aside to heal him in private, that corresponds to a pattern that we know from other miracle workers and workers of magic, that people who perform these sorts of wonders, or believed to be wonders, often want to do so in private. So that doesn't seem implausible that there were already stories circulating, or maybe that Jesus as a healer himself historically already took people aside in secret to heal them. So that's a reservation that even Vreda recognizes in his book, that miracle workers do like to do things in secret. But the other thing that I would like to emphasize, and this is something that I've studied more, I think, since I finished my work on Mark. When you look at other messianic figures, including Jewish messiahs, they often have a similar sort of, quote, messianic secret. For example, this book, which is about Jewish messiahs, I think starting with Jesus and then going up to the present day, or whenever this book was written, 20 years ago or so.
And what are Crown Heights?
Okay, and Crown Heights, we're going to come to this, but Crown Heights is where the Lubavitcher Rebbe lived. And I'm going to talk about him in a moment. But he is, one of the most, well, he's the most recent Jewish Messiah I know about, right? We're going to talk about him. So this is 2,000 years of Jewish messiahs, and you read through this book, and these guys often tried to keep their identity, their messianic identity, secret, at least for a while. For one thing, because messiahs, self-proclaimed messiahs, or people who are believed to be messiahs, often have a short lifetime. It's a dangerous thing to be believed in as Messiah. And also, it's very interesting, he shows that some of these guys, they kind of had doubts about themselves, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so that's also a possible psychological reason why somebody who is believed to be Messiah, or even who may think that he may be the Messiah, he may also have doubts about himself. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, born originally somewhere, I don't know, part of Poland or the Ukraine, but, came to the States and settled where there were a lot of Hasidic groups in Brooklyn. But this group of his, Chabad, the Lubavitcher group from the place in, I think it was in Poland, Lubavitch is a town somewhere. I've done an article or two about this. There are some amazing parallels with the early Christian movement. And it seems pretty clear, I think, that he did think that he was the Messiah, but he did not allow his followers to proclaim it openly. But there were instances, for example, where they sang a song proclaiming the advent of the Messiah in his presence, and he didn't tell them to shut up. He didn't silence them. But he never came out in public and said, I am the Messiah. But he was believed to be the Messiah, probably by most of his followers. Then he had a stroke in, I think, 1992 or 1993. He lay between life and death for a long time. He finally died in 94, but that did not even end the belief in him by his most ardent followers. And so at this point, the Lubavitch Chabad movement is split between those who think that his death revealed that he was not the Messiah, and those who think that it did not, and that he's still alive. So that's a further parallel with the Christian movement. He is believed to be alive by his followers. They even sometimes use language of resurrection. They believe that they can communicate with him, among other ways, by taking a book, of his sayings and discourses and just opening it at random, and people find that where they open the book, it has something amazingly relevant to their lives. So that, anyway, I could go on and on about him. But I guess studying him and people like him has made me be a little less ardently on the side of Vrede, because it does seem like messiahs often want to conceal their identity. And I think this reveals something that was already debated in Vrede's time by Albert Schweitzer. I mean, Vrede's book and Schweitzer's, Schweitzer wrote a book about the Messianic secret, I think, like at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901 or so. And he was already responding to ideas like those of Vrede, and Schweitzer didn't agree, because Schweitzer thought that hiddenness is an integral part of the apocalyptic sort of milieu out of which he thought Jesus came. And so Schweitzer never accepted Vrede's sort of literary and dogmatic interpretation of the Messianic secret. Schweitzer was more on the side of those who said that the Messianic secret did reveal something important about the historical Jesus, namely that he was an apocalyptic figure for whom hiddenness and revelation was a basic dichotomy. And I mean, you can see this, for example, again in this apocalyptic Jewish book, First Enoch, in this section that features a figure called a son of man, and there are various aspects of him which are described as being hidden. They're hidden from the public at large, revealed only to the elect. So the Son of Man was concealed with the chosen one, but now he has been revealed, but he has only been revealed to those to whom the mystery has been given. I don't know. What's my conclusion? I'm not sure. I mean, it does seem to me that Vrede is largely right, that at least in the sense that it seems like there are passages in which Mark has emphasized this feature. And I would point, for example, to like some of these summary passages of what Jesus was doing, which most people say go back to Mark himself, and in which the secret is emphasized in the sense that, you know, the demons cried out, "You are the Son of God," and Jesus told them to be quiet. I think there's other passages which I would identify as redactional, where the secret is emphasized. But as I said, Vrede also recognized that Mark didn't make it up. It went back to the church. For him, it went back to the church before Mark. And maybe some aspects of it go back to the historical Jesus. So that's what I've got. What I've got maybe is confusion, but I think it is a mixture of things. There's probably historical memory there, but it has been developed by the church and especially by Mark, so that it becomes a major theme in his gospel. And if you look at Matthew and Luke, who used Mark as a source, you can see that they de-emphasize it. They take out some of these passages in which Jesus tells people not to talk about him. So it's obviously not as important to them as it is to Mark. Okay, well, that's What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Joel. The basic dichotomy that you brought before our eyes and on our screens was the dichotomy between those who believe that messianic secret goes back to historical Jesus, like Schweitzer, and those who believe that the idea of messianic secret was created in the early church, or probably by Mark himself, like Vrede.
Yeah, Vrede didn't think that Mark created it. He thought that, but he developed it further. But he thinks, again, people don't often recognize this, but he thinks that there are some passages in which the motif is traditional, like, Jesus taking somebody aside to heal them.
Yes, but for the moment, it is not even so important for us whether we think this motif goes back to Vrede or to the early, or to his predecessors. What's important is that it doesn't go back to historical Jews, but was created by the early church, whether by Mark or by one of his predecessors. It's not so important in this regard. And then both hypotheses, both choices have some sub-choices, sub-hypotheses. Namely, when we trace, if we trace the messianic secret back to Jesus, we can suggest different explanations for this. For example, Jews' aversion of popularity or fear of being arrested too early for his mission, and so on and so on. What is it might be interesting just to think about what these motifs might have been for the historical Jesus if the messianic secret goes back to historical Jesus. But probably even more interesting would be to try to enumerate what kind of explanations or what kind of motifs might have been behind the early church's invention of messianic secret, if it was invented by Mark or by one of his predecessors. Vrede's idea was that the idea of messianic secret was invented in order to explain for the new generation of Christians how could it happen that those who were eyewitnesses of the earthly life of Jesus did not remember too many miracles, or probably remembered no miracles at all, if you put this line towards its logical end. But then after the Easter events and after Jesus' resurrection, we have a lot of miracles created in the name of Jesus.
Yes, well, what I would say, the way, and I wasn't as clear about this in my presentation as I should have been. What Vrede actually says is that the motif, as an expression of Mark's theology, comes out of the contrast between the non-messianic life of Jesus and the church's belief that Jesus was the Messiah. So that's the way that he puts it more exactly. He thinks that there was this, still this memory that Jesus had, he had done various things, but that he wasn't known as Messiah. But the church believed he was Messiah. And it was out of the tension between those two things, he thinks, that the messianic secret motif was created. Namely, the answer is yes, he was Messiah, already in his lifetime, but he kept that secret. And, you know, not many people have followed Vrede in that particular explanation. And the one that, though I think, you know, most of the scholarship has sided more with Vrede than it has with Schweitzer in thinking that it primarily expresses Mark's theology.
Joel, I'm sorry, I missed the first part, so I'm sorry if it was in your presentation, but I just remember that Father Brown thinks like Vrede. Is it right?
You know, I'm not sure. Raymond Brown, you're talking about.
Raymond Brown, yeah.
You know, Brown had a conservative streak, and I know at least in the case of the Gospel of John, he was really often siding with C.H. Dodd, who said that, well, maybe some of this stuff does actually go back to Jesus. But, you know, there are people who are more on the side of the motif being historical, like Jimmy Dunn, you know, who died a few years ago. He has an article in which he tries to argue for it being historical. So it may be that Ray would have liked Vrede because in Vrede's interpretation of Mark, Mark is very theological in a similar way to the way that he is in that John is theological. So I'm not sure. I don't recall Ray Brown talking about this, but if you can find a passage, I'd be interested to see it.
Yeah, I recently I listened to several of his lectures, which are in YouTube, and he was talking about it.
Okay, well, yeah, if you can find the one, I'd be interested in that.
I can show you. Yeah, it's very impressive just to listen to his.
He was quite a lecturer, and
yeah,
he did most of those things without notes, you know, just out of his head. He just knew so much, and yeah. But I mean, I would say this is still a debate, and it has to do with a larger debate about how creative was Mark. Was Mark a creative theologian so that he could just, you know, shape these stories at will to express his theology? Or was he mostly a collector of traditions? So one scholar of Mark, Rudolf Pesch, and also Paddy Best, Ernest Best in Scotland. I think Best took up the implication, or maybe what Pesch had actually said, and he called Mark a conservative redactor. So he does, you know, edit things, but he does so in a conservative way. And I would say that debate is still ongoing, except that, I mean, a lot of people these days, they don't even want to go into historical questions, you know, so they'll just read Mark as a literary work without trying to trace its background in time and space. But the debate is still there, and it's there, I think, partly because of the inconsistencies in Mark. You know, Jesus does hide his identity sometimes. He tells people, don't say anything, but then sometimes he doesn't do that. He performs a miracle and everybody sees it. And then sometimes he tells somebody not to say what has happened to them and they obey him. But then sometimes he tells them not to proclaim what he has done and they go out and they disobey. So it's these inconsistencies that, at least for me, mean that it's not one explanation fits everything. But I also think that it's true that this is a much more prominent feature in Mark than in other Gospels. But maybe, the best comparison again is John, because, Jesus in John, the eyes of Jesus' enemies at least are blinded so that they can't realize who he is. I guess the other thing I would say is that, it's often the case that mysticism is all about what's hidden, what most people cannot see, but has only been revealed to a few. And apocalyptic mysticism is about, the reality of the new world, which most people do not yet see, but which everybody will see at some point in the future. And I do think that Schweitzer was right, that framework of the hiddenness of the present evil age versus, the total revelation that is going to happen when God intervenes definitively, finally, that those two have something to do with each other.
Thank you, Joel. I return to my earlier question of what might have been theological reasons for the early church or Mark editing of the Jewish tradition. If the notion of Messianic secret was invented by early church or by Mark, what might have been theological ideas? One is that one hypothesis is that we just heard about, which goes back to Virgil, that it was a contrast between the non-messianic historical Jesus and the messianic geschichtliche Jesus. And you started your presentation, your lecture, with a statement that, in fact, of all the passages that are discussed under the label Messianic secret, strictly speaking, only one passage, namely Peter's confession, deals with the problem of whether Jesus is Messiah or not. Other passages deal with other issues, and mostly with issues of Jesus' dignity, Jesus' glory, Jesus' dignity as miracle worker. So if we contrast
Jesus' teaching, sometimes teaching about
Jesus' teaching. Yeah. So if we contrast the historical Jesus and the Jews of the early church following the alliance of Vrede, but looking at all these passages, not only to Peter's confession, then we must arrive at a conclusion that not only the idea of Jesus being a Messiah, but also the ideas of Jesus being a son of God. Demons proclaim that he's son of God.
Right.
And even the idea of Jesus being a miracle worker were absent from the memories of historical Jesus. And since they appeared in the teaching of the early church, it was somehow necessary for the early church, maybe for the tradition before Mark, to explain how did it happen that nobody knew about this before Jesus' death. But now we know about this. And this was the origin of the messianic secret, the miracle worker secret, the Son of God secret, and so on. And it's interesting that if, of course, the transfiguration is also within this area of secretness. And if the transfiguration is a resurrection appearance moved in the narrative,
Right.
But
That's what I think.
because the time of the earthly Jesus, then this is also an example of thing that was not in the image of the historical Jesus, but was later incorporated in
Yes.
the image of historical Jesus, and some explanation for this was
Yeah.
to be invented.
I mean, I think Vreda's theory it's a little bit abstract and complicated. You know, it's like the early Christians were, you know, they were basically thinking about a theory of history, you know, and how come, you know, well, we have these memories, Jesus wasn't messianic, but we believe he was, so, you know, somehow they come up with this idea which reconciles it. And I don't know, it seems a little bit academic and professorial to me. You know, it's the sort of thing that, you know, somebody sitting in Marburg and thinking a lot might come up with. So I think in general, that solution of Vreda's, you know, hasn't been so accepted. But what has been accepted is that this is a very important feature, especially of this gospel, which the conventional explanations and the 19th century ones, a lot of them were psychological, you know, for some psychological reason or some reason of pedagogical reason. Jesus didn't want to reveal that he was the Messiah. And what Vreda is best in is deconstructing these psychological interpretations. His own interpretation, I think, points in a constructive direction, because I think there is something theological about the messianic motif in Mark. But you know, the question that Schweitzer raises is, whose theology does it express? Is it the theology of Mark, or is it possibly the theology of the apocalyptic figure Jesus? Or is it some mixture of those two? And I guess I think that probably in the end it's a mixture of the two.
And then I would also like to raise a second question. We looked at while speaking about possible theological explanations of the early church inventing the messianic secret, if it was invented by the early church, we followed Vrede's idea that it was invented to reconcile the post-Easter image of Jesus with the image of historical Jesus. But other theological explanations might have been brought into picture. For example, it's very interesting and important for me, at least, that everywhere in Mark we see, probably this goes back to Mark himself, I don't know, the emphasis on importance of being humble, importance of not being too triumphalistic, importance of some opposition towards the connotations of power and hierarchy. So could it be that the messianic secret, if it was invented by Mark, for example, was invented not because the early tradition contained too little material about Jesus' messianic dignity and Jesus being Son of God and Jesus being miracle worker, but on the contrary, because the previous tradition contained too much elements of this. And Mark, in accordance with the overall tendency of his gospel to downplay everything of that kind, was imposing this idea of messianic secret as a model for a Christian. Even though you know that Jesus was a powerful miracle worker, a Messiah, Son of God, and so on, you should keep in mind that he didn't want this to be a main components of his identity, not to be in the fore. In some sense, this theological interpretation is completely opposite to Vredes. Because in Vredes' idea, Mark or the early church wanted to say, you guys, you do not, you know that Jesus was not Messiah, Son of Man, and so on. And we tell you that he was, and here we have a completely different.
No, that's very good, and that that does correspond to an interpretation I've talked about a few times before. Like in the 60s, there were people like Theodore Whedon, especially students of Norman Perrin, who said that this image of Jesus as a miracle worker, which is it's very prominent, especially in the first half of the gospel. Jesus performs one miracle after another until like not the last one. The last one is blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10. But as the gospel goes on, there gets to be fewer and fewer. And these guys said that Mark sort of sets up Jesus as a miracle worker and as a glorious Messiah in the first half or so of the gospel, and then he knocks that down in the second half, where it's revealed that is a misunderstanding, and the real Messiah is revealed only through his suffering and death. So, it's partly importing a kind of Lutheran antithesis between a theology of glory and a theology of suffering. But I think there's something to it, and this interpretation was popular, I think, partly because a lot of people in the church, at least in America in those days, were very anti-authoritarian. So the disciples were associated with this misunderstanding of Jesus as a figure of power, and then and this is true, and it's something else that we could have talked about. As the gospel progresses, they seem to misunderstand more and more. So the disciples are associated with this misunderstanding of Jesus as just a Messiah of glory, and that has to be qualified by the theology of suffering. And I think these guys took it too far, but there's something to it. There is a difference between the gospel doesn't end in the place that you expect it to end from the beginning of the gospel. Even though if you were a Christian, you would have known that it would have to end with Jesus crucified. But just in literary terms, the first half sets up an expectation which is not met in the second half and is really projected onto the second coming. When he comes back, he'll be the figure of glory.
Yes, several times we came across this anti-authoritarian idea in Mark, and remembered Norman Perrin and his disciples in the States in 1960s. But I just do not know whether I think there should have been some people who linked, who tried to link these anti-authoritarian ideas in Mark with the theory of Mark's invention of the messianic secret.
Oh,
Were
yeah,
there any attempts to root the messianic secret of Mark in his anti-authoritarian and anti-glorious Jesus theology?
yeah, I think that's where the Perrin people were coming from. Perrin and Whedon, who Whedon has an article in which he, explains most of his ideas, and then he developed it in his dissertation. So I think you could look to him, and Perrin had a whole school. He discipled a lot of people to write monographs on the Gospel of Mark, and they were quite influential for a while. And it was interesting to me, our friend Tobias Niklas, who's been at some of these ELC colloquia, he presented a paper at one of them that was basically the same idea. And I'm not sure he had done all the history of research, but it seemed to me that where it was coming from, and I'm not saying that he was totally wrong or that this point of view is totally wrong, but it seemed to me that it was partly reflecting his own struggles with the Catholic hierarchy in his own setting in Germany. So, I mean, this always happens, that we reflect what is happening in our environment, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It may be that our environment sensitizes us to things that were actually already happening in the biblical text and in the biblical setting. But I guess I always try, and I probably don't always succeed, to then be critical of the ideas I want to be true. And that's not always easy.
But this means that, in fact, we do not have just two opposing explanations of messianic secret going back to Jesus and messianic secret invented by the church, but at least three completely different conceptions. The idea of messianic secret going back to historical Jesus, messianic secret invented to tell that Jesus was much more powerful miracle worker, much more messianic figure, much more glorious figure than you thought. And the third idea, that it was invented by the early church of Mark, but with a completely different agenda, to tell people that Jesus was much more meek, not glorious and humble person than you think.
No, I've never thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's a very valuable insight, which one of the younger generation, which you or one of your disciples needs to develop. Because I mean, that is the way that you're synthesizing it. I haven't seen that synthesized before, in terms of just the issue of power. That is there too much power in the tradition or too little power in the tradition? I guess, you could pose the question in a sharp way in that way.
Yes, because the whole issue of messianic secret is in contrast between powerful Jesus and powerless Jesus.
Yeah.
And if this contrast does not go back to Jesus himself, who was at the same time powerful and powerless, then there are two completely different explanations. Either the church invented the powerful Jesus in order to explain why people who remember the earthly Jesus do not remember such a powerful figure, or once a completely a contrary thing, Mark inventing powerless Jesus in order to give a model for a creature how to live, and not according to the powerful image that
Yeah.
you inherited from Mark's predecessors.
Yeah, I mean, the only modification I would introduce, and we'll probably talk about this if we ever get to the crucifixion itself, which maybe we will in another few years, but maybe in my lifetime. But yes, I think that the crucifixion in Mark, you see a powerless Jesus there. You see a Jesus who feels and maybe is abandoned by God. But there is power there, even in the scene of the crucifixion. Even at the moment that Jesus dies, the curtain is torn, and I think that means that the Shekinah, the glory of God starts to go out into the world. So, and I guess I emphasize this for theological reasons too. I've heard people sort of saying that Christianity is all about powerlessness, and you should just, humble yourself, and not try to be powerful. But I think there's a dialectic in at least Mark's version of Christianity, that it's by humbling yourself that you become powerful. The last shall be first. And Jesus dies with the cry of dereliction on his lips, but that is, in that very moment, God's power is being revealed, so that it's not just, that the humbling yourself isn't an end in itself, but it's because of, the revelation of God's power that can take place in these arenas in which things seem to be hopeless.
Thank you, Joel. And one more question that I would like to ask you with regard to the Messianic secret. I hope that at some time our seminar will come to the very end of the gospel. But can we say that this abrupt end of the gospel of Mark has also something to do with the notion of secret? Because in fact, the only witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, according to the Gospel of Mark, are the ladies that came to his tomb.
And they run away and they don't tell anybody.
Yes. So this is the secret of secrets.
Yeah. I think if the gospel did actually originally end there, that would be a good conclusion, and I think it may very well have ended there. So that in some sense the secret continues even past the end of the gospel. But of course, it's not a secret to the readers of the gospel. They know from the very beginning, from 1:1, or at least from 1:11, that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. So again, what was hidden in Jesus' lifetime is now an open secret for the readers of the gospel. But yeah, I think you can't really talk about the Messianic secret without talking about the ending. And I think if it does end at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women running away and not saying anything to anyone, that does, again, qualify a theology of glory. And it puts more of the emphasis on the crucifixion than on the resurrection. In early Christianity, I think those two events are they're part of a gestalt, but I think the different Gospels and the different New Testament writers put more emphasis maybe on one or on another. And so I think if the Gospel ended at 16:8, then Mark is wanting to shift the emphasis to the crucifixion, but he also thinks that the resurrection did happen, right? Jesus says, when I am raised from the dead. The angel at the tomb says, go into Galilee and there you will see him. But it doesn't narrate that event. It doesn't narrate resurrection appearances as all the other Gospels do.
Yes,
And that may be a deliberate choice.
Yes, and this also goes very well hand in hand with the topic of the Messianic secret, because with regard to the Messianic secret, we have the same picture, because at least the reader knows what the secret is all about. Even though the secret is there, but it is no more secret for the reader. The same with the ending. The secret is there. Nobody is actually told about Jesus' resurrection, but still the reader knows this even before opening the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think it can even be a more powerful way to refer to something if you don't describe it, but and especially if it's something that every Christian knows about. Every Christian knows that Jesus was raised from the dead. So you don't, and probably all of Mark's readers know that there's these stories about resurrection appearances. I mean, you already get a series of them in 1 Corinthians 15 from Paul. So you wouldn't be a Christian without knowing stories about resurrection appearances. And especially for something that's so ineffable as a resurrected Jesus, it may be a deliberate choice. I'm not going to try to describe this. I'm just going to allude to it and let the reader's imagination fill in the blanks. And I like to compare it to, I've seen documentaries about President John F. Kennedy. His last day, he's driving through the streets of Dallas. He and his wife are waving at people, everybody, and people are happy and they're waving back at him. And the documentary ends there. It doesn't show what happens next, even though we've got film footage. It just ends there with them waving and people waving back because everybody knows what happens next. So you don't have to describe it. And it can be a more powerful way of alluding to it, not to describe it. Maybe.
Okay. I have put a lot of questions to our discussions, but I think that maybe other members of our small seminar also have some questions to ask.
This is your opportunity to learn the meaning of the secret.
Если кто-то хотел бы задать вопрос по-русски для нашей дискуссии.
I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yes. Я думаю, что у нас здесь я или кто-нибудь еще мог бы взять на себя перевод. Это вопросы на английский язык. Или можете задавать вопросы по-английски. Потому что сегодня, конечно же, мы говорили про, может быть, самый важный из всех мотивов, которые пронизывают Евангелие от Марка, да?
Well, I'm sure we'll return to these questions as we move. We still have many messianic secret passages, to encounter, as well as the end of the gospel, which I think you're certainly right that it's intricately involved. Another thing that's involved that I don't think I emphasized is, not only outsiders, but also the disciples increasingly misunderstand Jesus. And Vreda does link this misunderstanding motif with the messianic secret. And that is also something that the other Gospels de-emphasize. The disciples are not as stupid in Matthew and Luke and John, not as consistently stupid as they are in Mark. And of course, because also all of the other Gospels have resurrection appearance stories where the disciples are reconciled with Jesus, and Mark may not have that.
Okay. It was very interesting discussion today, and at least for me, when comparing these three possible explanations of the messianic secret, the explanation that would bring the messianic secret back to the historical Jesus, the Vrede type explanation, and the can we call it Perrin type explanation? How would you term the third explanation, so to speak, anti-Vrede explanation?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I'd call it the Lutheran explanation. Theology of suffering versus theology of glory.
But Luther didn't use this theology to explain the messianic secret in Mark.
True.
How can we call this type of explanation of messianic secret in Mark the historical Jewish explanation, the Vrede type explanation, and?
Well, I mean, I would associate with Whedon, who I think is a Lutheran, as a matter of fact.
Associated with whom?
With Theodore Whedon, who was a Lutheran.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the I would just call it the theology of suffering versus theology of glory, or theology of glory qualified by theology of suffering. Theology of glory set up in the first half of gospel, knocked down in second half of gospel. And yeah,
Joel, can you send us in a chat the name of the scholar whom we referred to, because I know Norman Perrin and I have read quite a lot of Perrin's works, but I'm afraid I haven't heard the last name that.
Yeah, it's Whedon, but I'll send you his article if I can
Okay.
find it, which
Okay.
Which has his theology, his theory in a nutshell. I mean, I think he goes too far, and he's not the most careful exegete, but he's stimulating. I always gave his article to my students because it was very sharply put, and he's on to something. It's just, the nuance. I mean, for example, he talks about the way the parable theory, to you has been given the mystery, but to those outside, everything is in parable. It sets up this dualism, which then immediately Mark qualifies, because Jesus then says to the disciples, don't you understand this parable? How will you understand all the parables? So first, that's kind of his paradigm for how this works. You first set something up, and then you knock it down or qualify it. And maybe that's what's going on there. But I'll send you his article if I can find it.
Okay, thank you.
Or even if I can't find it, yeah.
Yeah. But whatever name, whatever label we invent for this third type of explanation of Messianic secret.
Mhm.
I think that if we link the Messianic secret in the narrative of Mark with the abrupt ending of the Gospel of Mark, and remember that, of course, for everyone who read Paul's epistles, it was evident that Jesus was a powerful Messiah, or Christos, and so on and so on.
Mhm.
The more I think about this, the more this third explanation of the Messianic secret, which is different both from the traditional explanation through historical Jesus
Mhm.
and from Vrede's ideas,
Mhm.
seem plausible for me.
Yes, I think it's I think they're right about some things. It's I mean I got irritated with them sometimes because I thought they went too far, and because I and it has to do with what I was talking about before. There's a dialectic between power and powerlessness. It's not an one-sided exaltation of powerlessness. He's not just saying that you have to suffer and that's it. He's saying that in suffering, God, when you reach your limit, God enters the scene. and and I think pastorally, that's a more satisfactory theology than just saying being a Christian is suffering.
I would say that the third hypothesis, the third explanation, looks looks to be the most text-based because it doesn't need any huge assumptions besides what we have in text.
Yeah, I
like it.
guess, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's all.
I mean, I guess I think you're right that it's sensitive to the dynamics of the text. But I but I'm not sure if you show Jesus as a miracle worker for like 8 or 9, 10 chapters, I mean, is the ending of the gospel going to totally wash that away? Does it totally negate it? I don't think it does. You've got to somehow synthesize those two things. And at least as I remember reading not Vrede, Whedon and Perrin and so on, they seem to think, and maybe partly in line with what was going on in our country at that point, that it's negating it totally, and it's totally saying that power is not the way, but weakness is the way of Jesus. So anyway, but I'll send the article and you all can see what you think of it.
Thank you, Joe. According to the letter that we had from the organizers of our seminar, we had to look today at verse 9:41, but I think that we had a very important discussion on Messianic secret, so that our discussion of verse 9:41 will return to this in our next academic year. I think it was very good and in some sense symbolic that we ended our cycle of this year's seminars on Mark with that brilliant presentation on one of the most important characteristic features of the Gospel of Mark, And once again, I think all of us would like to say you, Joel, a lot of thanks for your being with us and sharing with us your ideas.
Well,
Thank
thank you. And that's, I mean, that's the best discussion I think I've ever had of the Messianic secret, and you've given me things to think about. So
Yeah.
more will be revealed.
More will be revealed
Yeah,
during our next seminars.
there and other places. Yeah. We will no longer look and not see.
Yes. By the way, Joel, if you want, you can send us the PowerPoint presentations that you had today and also at some other places in our meetings.
Son of
There were really important presentations that.
Sin Chilovechistvi.
Yes.
I'll send you that one. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay. See you
And-
in September or whenever. Yeah.
Joel, thank you.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you
it's
so
great
much.
Thursday to
До свидания. До скорого.
До свидания. До скорого.
Don't work too hard.
Okay. Agreed.
Cheers.
bye-bye.
Георгиевич, а если вам Джоэль пришлет вот те статьи, о которых вы говорили, можно вас попросить тоже их переслать или как-то?
Да,
как-то?
да,
Пожалуйста.
конечно. Конечно. Давайте их разошлем.
Всем нам спасибо большое.
Всем нам. Да. Хорошо. Отец Сергей, давайте, может быть,
Да.
минут через 15 встретимся в Зуме, вот по той же самой ссылке, что
Отлично.
еще.
Отлично, все через 15 минут я тогда вот по этой же ссылке зайду. Большое спасибо.
Хорошо, хорошо.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Увидимся.
Большое спасибо. До свидания.
Большое спасибо.
Спасибо всем, кто с нами был на протяжении этого года. Вот, это очень здорово, что у нас есть такой маленький коллектив, работающий над этими вещами.
Аминь, аминь.
Аминь, аминь.
Аминь, аминь.
Спасибо за
Спасибо
гостеприимство.
большое.
Всего доброго.
До свидания, всего доброго.
Спасибо.